The man who was at the bottom of the well finds something mysterious in an old book. What he discovers next transforms his life in an unexpected way. When a man at the bottom of the well finds something mysterious, his world turns upside down. John Parker embarks on a journey in search of a hidden village, where he will find answers he never imagined. Amidst old secrets and new friendships, he is led to confront the pains of the past and the mysteries that haunt his present. But what will he discover along the way? John Parker, at 38 years old, lived in the historic city of New Orleans, where the vibrant colors and street music contrasted deeply with the emptiness that filled his life. 2 years earlier, he had lost his wife, Margaret, in a tragic car accident. Since then, the joy he once knew had been brutally ripped from his chest, leaving an abyss that seemed endless. John's mornings began and ended the same way. He would wake up late, avoid the mirror, and wander around the house like a ghost. The walls of the house that he and Margaret had decorated together, with travel paintings and photos of happy moments, were now painful reminders of a time he could never get back. The outside world had become a place he avoided at all costs. The parties and gatherings that once enlivened his spirit were now distant memories, eclipsed by a deep loneliness. The only refuge John still held onto was his collection of old books. A collector since he was young, he would spend hours immersed in stories that transported him to other worlds, far from the dark reality he lived in. The books were all that remained of a life that seemed to crumble with each passing day. He had no more friends, had distanced himself from family, and although he continued to work remotely as a freelance editor, his passion for the job had completely faded. The only company he tolerated was the growing pile of old volumes in the corner of the room. One gray afternoon, while searching for something to read, John noticed a book he didn't remember seeing before. It was an old edition with a worn leather cover and no title. Curiosity, one of the few emotions that still seemed to work in his body, led him to pick up the book and settle into the armchair by the window, where sunlight filtered through the dusty curtains. As he opened the book, John noticed that the pages were stuck together in a specific section. He tried to separate them, but the paper was delicate, and any sudden movement could destroy them. Carefully, he used a thin blade to separate the sheets, and to his surprise, he discovered an old letter hidden inside. The paper was yellowed with age, and the elegant handwriting indicated that the letter had been written a long time ago. The letter was dated 40 years ago and was signed by someone named Thomas. "Dear John," the letter read, "if you are reading this, it means that life has brought you to this moment for a reason. There is something you need to discover, something that can change the course of your existence. Look for a hidden village in the mountains of North Carolina. There you will find the happiness you seek." John felt a shiver run down his spine. The coincidence of his own name being mentioned in the letter and the promise of a life-changing discovery sparked something inside him. For the first time in years, he felt a faint spark of curiosity and hope. Who was Thomas? And why was this letter hidden in one of his books? What could he find in this mysterious village? That night was the first in a long time that John didn't toss and turn in bed, unable to sleep. Instead, he stayed awake, thinking about the letter's words, imagining what might happen if he decided to follow that clue. Perhaps, just maybe, this was the chance he needed to get out of the deep well he found himself in. As he tried to sleep, flashes of his life with Margaret came to mind. The shared smiles, the trips, the nights when he played guitar for her. Music had always been an important part of his life, but since the accident, he couldn't even look at the guitar he had stored away. The pain was unbearable, but now, the possibility of a new journey ignited something in him that had long been extinguished. At dawn, John made a decision. He would pack his things and set off in search of that village in the mountains of North Carolina. The days that followed were a mix of anxiety and excitement for John. For so long, he had felt nothing but a crushing emptiness. But now he found himself in the midst of a restlessness that kept him moving. The decision to follow the clues from the mysterious letter seemed to have reignited a forgotten flame within him. It wasn't just the possibility of finding answers, but the simple fact of having a purpose, something to look forward to. John spent hours researching villages in the mountains of North Carolina. He discovered that the region was rich in small communities, many of them isolated and full of old stories. However, none of the places he found in his searches mentioned anyone named Thomas, nor did they allude to anything that matched the letter he had in hand. At one point, John began to question whether he was embarking on madness, chasing a fantasy born out of desperation. But something inside him insisted that he continue, as if this journey was more than just finding a physical place. It was an internal quest, a dive into himself, in the hope of rescuing what he had lost. Finally, after days of preparation, John packed some clothes in his suitcase, along with the letter, and set off by car toward the neighboring state. The journey was long, cutting through landscapes that changed from urban to rural, until he found himself surrounded by the green, imposing mountains of North Carolina. During the drive, John's mind wandered, thinking of Margaret and the many trips they had taken together. She had always been his support, the person who knew exactly how to calm his fears and anxieties. The idea of facing this journey without her was terrifying, but it also seemed like the right thing to do. Maybe somewhere along this road he could find a way to finally move on. When John arrived in the small town of Asheville, he decided to stop to stretch his legs and perhaps ask a few questions about the village described in the letter. Asheville was a vibrant town, with its streets filled with artists, musicians, and tourists. However, no matter how much he asked, no one seemed to know of any specific village that matched John's description. It wasn't until he stopped at a small bookstore, tucked away on one of the side streets of the town, that he found a clue. The bookseller, an elderly man named Henry, listened to John's description and, after a pause, smiled with a mysterious air. "You're not the first to come here looking for that village," Henry said, his eyes gleaming with renewed interest. "Few people know about it, but many years ago, there were rumors of a place like that in the mountains. It's not on the maps, of course, but if you head north, there's an old road that was abandoned decades ago. They say it leads to a village that few know about. And as for Thomas, well, it's a name I've heard before, though I don't remember exactly where." John felt a mix of relief and nervousness. Finally, a concrete direction. He thanked the bookseller and, with a rudimentary map in hand, returned to the car, feeling more determined than ever. Now he had a path to follow. The road Henry mentioned was indeed old and seldom used. Tall trees lined it, creating a natural tunnel that blocked the sunlight in some stretches. As he drove, John felt a growing sense of isolation, as if he were moving away from the known world and entering a territory forgotten by time. After hours of driving, the winding road led him to a small village. There were no signs, just a community hidden among the mountains. The houses were simple, made of wood, with slanted roofs, and the silence that reigned in the place was almost supernatural. John parked the car and got out, feeling the fresh, pure air of the place. The village seemed suspended in time, a relic from another era. John walked through the dirt streets, observing the few inhabitants who seemed surprised to see a stranger. He tried to talk to some of them, asking about Thomas, but they all shook their heads, saying they had never heard of that name. Discouraged, John began to think that maybe it had all been a mistake, a fruitless search. But before returning to the car, something caught his attention. A small shop, with a wooden sign gently swaying in the wind, bore the word Antiques, engraved in letters worn by time. It was a small place, almost hidden at the end of the main street. Not knowing what to expect, John entered the shop, where he was greeted by a familiar aroma of old wood and aged leather. The place was filled with antique objects, from furniture and clocks to musical instruments. At the counter, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a serene expression greeted him with a smile. "Welcome," she said, "Can I help you with something?" John hesitated for a moment but decided to tell his story. After all, he had come this far. He explained about the letter he had found and his search for Thomas. The woman, who introduced herself as Evelyn, listened attentively, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. When John finished speaking, Evelyn remained silent for a moment, as if processing everything. Finally, she smiled and said, "Perhaps you haven't found Thomas, but you've found something even more important. Sometimes, the answers we seek aren't in the people we're looking for, but in the paths we choose to follow." John felt Evelyn's words penetrate deep into his heart. She was right. John found in Evelyn a patient listener and a perceptive counselor. In the days that followed his arrival in the village, he began to visit her regularly at the small antique shop. The conversations initially revolved around his search for Thomas and the unanswered questions the letter had left. However, over time, these sessions began to delve deeper into the pains and anxieties he had carried for so long. Evelyn revealed herself to be an experienced psychologist who had decided to settle in that village to escape the chaos of big cities and reconnect with a simpler and more meaningful life. She had realized, from the first encounter with John, that he was on the verge of an emotional collapse, living as a man without purpose, just waiting for the days to pass. During one of these conversations, Evelyn suggested they explore Margaret's loss more deeply. Reluctant at first, John eventually gave in. He talked about how he had met Margaret in college, how she had always been the pillar of his life, the person who made him believe that anything was possible. He described the crushing emptiness that settled in after her death, a feeling he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. "It's as if everything I did before, all my hobbies, my interests, none of it made sense without her," John confessed, his voice choked with emotion. Evelyn listened attentively, as she always did, before asking a question that caught him by surprise. "John, what brought you joy before Margaret entered your life? Is there something you loved to do? Something that was just yours?" The question echoed in John's mind for days. He tried to remember something that made him happy before meeting Margaret, but everything seemed shrouded in a dense fog. It wasn't until he was walking through the village, lost in thought, that something struck him like lightning. Music. John had always loved music. In his youth, he spent hours playing guitar, composing melodies that he never shared with anyone. It was a secret passion, something that connected him to himself in a way that nothing else could. He used to play for Margaret on the nights they were alone at home, creating an intimate atmosphere that seemed to suspend time. However, since her death, he couldn't even look at the guitar that was stored in a corner of the room, covered in dust. The memory of the songs he played for her was too painful. As he walked through the village streets, these thoughts occupied his mind until he came across a different antique shop, smaller and more discreet than Evelyn's. In the window, an old guitar caught his eye. The instrument seemed decades old, but it still exuded a certain charm that made John stop and stare for long minutes. Driven by a feeling he could barely explain, John entered the shop. The owner, an elderly man with a welcoming smile, noticed his interest in the guitar and approached to chat. "It's a beautiful instrument, isn't it? It belonged to a family from this village. The son, who used to play it, left many years ago and never returned. But they say this guitar still has music in it, waiting to be played again." The old man's words resonated with John in a way he couldn't ignore. There was something in that story, in that guitar, that seemed destined to cross his path. Without thinking much, he decided to buy it, feeling that somehow it was part of his journey. That night, back at the small cabin he had rented, John sat on the porch under the starry sky and took the guitar out of its case. The touch of the strings under his fingers brought a wave of nostalgia, a mix of pain and longing that almost made him give up. But he persisted, playing a simple melody that came to his mind, a melody he and Margaret used to sing together. The music, which started hesitantly, soon flowed more naturally. As the chords came together, John felt something loosen inside him, as if the notes were washing his soul, relieving the weight he had carried for so long. He played until his fingers began to ache, until the emptiness he felt gave way to a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The next day, John shared his experience with Evelyn, who smiled as she listened to how the music had touched him so deeply. Sometimes, John, what we need most isn't to leave behind what we've lost, but to reconnect with what we love. Margaret will always be a part of you, but that doesn't mean you should abandon everything that brings you joy. The days in the village began to take on a new color. John, motivated by his conversations with Evelyn and the rediscovery of music, began to feel more alive. He spent hours playing the guitar, composing new melodies, letting his emotions flow through the strings. And it was on one of those afternoons, while playing in the village square, that something unexpected happened. An elderly man, frail in appearance, approached John and stood there, listening silently. There was something familiar about the man, though John couldn't quite place it. When he finished playing, the man came closer and, with tear-filled eyes, asked, "Where did you learn that melody?" Surprised, John replied, "It was a song I used to play for my wife." "But why do you ask? Do you know it?" The man, with a choked voice, murmured, "That was my wife's favorite melody too. I am Thomas, and that guitar, it belonged to my family." The name Thomas echoed in John's mind like thunder. He could hardly believe what he had just heard. For so long, he had searched for any clue about this mysterious man, and now, there he was in the flesh right before his eyes. The initial shock left him speechless, but when he managed to compose himself, John asked, "Are you Thomas? The Thomas from the letter I found? What happened? How did this guitar end up in the antique shop?" Thomas, visibly emotional, nodded slowly. His eyes, which seemed to carry the weight of many decades, met John's with a mix of sadness and relief. "Yes, I am. I wrote that letter many years ago, but I never imagined anyone would find it, let alone that it would lead you here." John was still trying to process all the information flooding his mind. "But why did you write that letter? And how is this guitar connected to all of this?" Thomas sighed, looking at the guitar in John's hands as if he were seeing an old friend. "That guitar belonged to my son. His name was John too, just like you. The letter you found was for him, but he never received it. At the time, I was searching for something that could bring us back the happiness we had lost. My wife, Sarah, had passed away, and I was devastated. I knew I needed to find a way to move on, for myself and for my son, so I wrote that letter, planning a trip to this village. I believed that maybe here we could find peace." John listened to every word intently, feeling a growing connection to a story that somehow seemed so close to his own life. He had never known his biological parents. He was adopted as a baby, and his life had always been shrouded in mysteries he never cared to unravel. Thomas continued, "When we arrived in the village, something changed. I began to reconnect with music, and that brought a certain relief to me, but my son, he never managed to overcome the loss of his mother. One day, he just left. He left the guitar and the letter behind. I never saw him again." John felt a knot form in his throat. He thought about his own life, about how pain had corroded his soul after Margaret's death, and how he had also distanced himself from everything and everyone, almost losing himself along the way. Thomas's story was a reflection of his own, and he couldn't help but wonder if there was something deeper connecting them. "Am I that John?" The question escaped John's lips before he could contain it, and he felt foolish for saying it out loud. But Thomas didn't laugh, nor did he show surprise. Instead, he looked deeply into John's eyes and said, "I don't know, but the way you play, the way you feel the music, it's so familiar. I don't want to create false hopes, but there's a chance, a small chance, that you could be the son I lost." The revelation hit John like an avalanche. He had never known anything about his biological parents. His adoptive parents had been loving and always gave him everything he needed, but there had never been much information about his origins. The idea that Thomas could be his biological father seemed both absurd and strangely plausible. Evelyn, who had arrived at the square shortly before, watched the scene from a distance. She slowly approached, sensing the tension in the air, and when John saw her, he felt a wave of relief knowing he wasn't alone in facing this situation. "Evelyn," John called, his voice laden with emotion. "This is Thomas, the man who wrote the letter, and he thinks I might be the son he lost so many years ago." Evelyn looked from John to Thomas and then back to John. It was hard to believe that all of this could be just a coincidence. "Let's sit down and talk about this," she suggested softly. "There's a lot to clarify, but before we jump to conclusions, we need more information." The three of them sat on a bench under the shade of a tree, and John recounted everything Thomas had shared. The psychologist, with her usual calm, suggested that they investigate further, perhaps with a DNA test to confirm whether the relationship between the two was truly that of father and son. "But before that," Evelyn said, looking at Thomas, "I think it would be important for the two of you to spend some time together, getting to know each other. Even if there isn't a biological connection, it's clear that there is a deep emotional bond between you. And in the end, that's what really matters." Thomas agreed, and so did John. There was a part of him that wanted to run away, return to his solitary life in New Orleans, but another part, one that was growing stronger every day, wanted to stay and discover the truth. He knew this journey wasn't just about finding answers, but also about finding himself. In the weeks that followed, John and Thomas spent a lot of time together. They played music, shared stories, and little by little, John began to feel a bond with the man who, until recently, was just a mysterious figure from an old letter. During one of these sessions, Thomas confessed, "I've always wondered what would have happened if I had been more open with my son, if I had managed to deal with my pain better. Maybe he wouldn't have left." John, feeling the same guilt in relation to Margaret, responded, "We all carry burdens, Thomas, but what's important is what we do with the second chances life gives us." The bond between them strengthened, and both John and Thomas began to feel a peace they hadn't experienced in a long time. The days that John and Thomas spent together were marked by a serene coexistence, almost as if they were making up for lost time. They spent hours at the small cabin where John was staying, playing guitar and discussing their lives. There was a connection that transcended time and distance between them, an inexplicable affinity that only seemed to grow. As the days passed, John felt a profound transformation within himself. He began to realize that the pain he carried from losing Margaret, though still present, was no longer so overwhelming. The music and Thomas's presence were filling the void in his heart, giving him a new purpose. Evelyn continued to closely accompany this journey, offering the necessary support and suggesting that, although the search for answers about paternity was important, it shouldn't be the only focus. Sometimes family isn't just about blood, John. It's about the connections we build, about how we choose to support each other. Evelyn's words resonated deeply with John, who began to understand that, regardless of the result of a DNA test, Thomas had already become a father figure in his life. But there was still a part of John that longed for concrete answers. He knew he would have to face this question, no matter how much he feared what he might discover. It was then that Evelyn suggested they do the DNA test. "It's a way to close this cycle of uncertainties, John. Whatever the result, you can move forward with clarity and peace." John agreed, as did Thomas. The two men went to a clinic in the nearest town and collected the necessary samples. Then they returned to the village to wait for the results, which would come in a few days. The wait was anxious. John tried to occupy himself with music and walks in the mountains, but his mind was constantly focused on what the future might bring. Thomas, on the other hand, seemed calm, as if he had already made peace with any outcome. When the day of the revelation finally arrived, John was nervous but also determined to face whatever came. Evelyn was by his side, and they went together to the clinic to pick up the results. The drive back to the village felt endless, and every second of waiting weighed on them. When they arrived at the cabin, John held the envelope with the result in his hands, hesitating for a moment before opening it. Thomas watched in silence, respecting John's space. Evelyn was also present, ready to support her friend in any circumstance. With trembling hands, John finally opened the envelope and read the contents. For a moment, the world around him seemed to stop. What he feared, but at the same time hoped for, was there in black and white. Thomas was not his biological father. The truth hit John like a stone. He felt disoriented, as if he were adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. Thomas, noticing the impact of the news, approached and placed a hand on John's shoulder. "John, I know this may be hard to accept, but I want you to know that regardless of what this paper says, you will always have a place in my life. Finding you brought back something I thought I had lost forever. You gave me a second chance, and for that, I am eternally grateful." John felt the tears burning in his eyes. He looked at Thomas and knew, deep down, that those words were sincere. Even though they didn't share the same blood, the bond they had created was real and deep. He knew that the DNA test didn't change what they had built together. Evelyn, who was observing the scene, smiled tenderly. Sometimes, the answers we seek aren't in test results or official papers. They're in the connections we make, in the people we choose to love and support. John, still processing everything, realized that he was at peace with the revelation. The truth, though unexpected, didn't diminish the value of the journey he had taken. In fact, it only reinforced the importance of the choices he had made, of the people he had decided to keep by his side. In the days that followed, John and Thomas continued to spend time together, but now without the shadow of doubt between them. The revelation hadn't driven them apart. On the contrary, it seemed to strengthen them. John felt lighter, as if he had finally found a new path, a new family, even if it wasn't in the way he had imagined. Determined to give back everything he had received, John began teaching music to the village children. He wanted to share the joy that music had brought him, helping others find the same comfort he had discovered. As the weeks passed, the village that initially seemed like just a stopover became John's home. Every day, he felt a stronger connection with the community, with Thomas, and with Evelyn, who had become his new family. The music that was once a painful memory was now his source of renewal and purpose. The music lessons that John started giving were received with enthusiasm by the local children, but also by the adults, who saw in him an inspiring figure. He transformed the old village school, which had been closed for a long time, into a community center for music and art. The melodies that echoed through the mountains now came from young people who, like him, found in music a form of expression and healing. Thomas, who spent more and more time alongside John, also got involved in the project. He helped repair the old instruments that the community donated, restoring them with the same care and dedication he put into everything he did. For him, seeing John flourish in that new role was a second chance, not only to be a father but to reconnect with life in a way he had never imagined. Evelyn, who had always been by John's side on his journey, watched with satisfaction as the man who was once broken transformed into a strong and resilient figure. She knew that he still carried the pain of losing Margaret, but now that pain no longer defined him. He had found a new meaning in his life, a purpose that went beyond himself. On a sunny afternoon, while John and Thomas were tuning the guitars for another music session, Evelyn appeared at the school with a radiant expression. She was holding an envelope similar to the one that contained the DNA test, but this time the content was a letter. "I received this letter from a friend in New Orleans," Evelyn said, handing it to John. "It looks like you've been invited to perform at a music festival there. I think word about what you're doing here in the village is starting to spread." John was surprised as he read the letter. The festival was an important event, and the invitation to participate was a unique opportunity. For a moment, he found himself torn between the new life he had built in the village and the possibility of returning to the city where his pain had begun. However, looking at Thomas and Evelyn, he knew what his answer would be. "I don't know if I'm ready to go back to New Orleans," John said thoughtfully, "but maybe it's time to share what we've found here with the world." Thomas nodded, understanding John's feelings. "You don't have to go back to the past, John. What you've done here with the music and with the people is something that can inspire others. Maybe this festival is a way to take that message forward." Evelyn, always the voice of reason, added, "You don't have to do this alone. Thomas and I will be by your side, as will the whole community you've helped build. This festival could be a way to show the world that, even in the most difficult situations, there is always a path to light." With these words of encouragement, John accepted the invitation. He knew that this trip would be different. It wouldn't be an escape as it had been so many times before, but rather a celebration of everything he had accomplished. He prepared carefully, choosing the songs he would play, each one representing a stage of his journey, a part of his story. The day of the festival arrived, and John stepped onto the stage feeling a calmness he hadn't experienced in a long time. The audience was vast, much larger than the small village he had grown accustomed to, but he didn't feel intimidated. Instead, he felt strengthened by the presence of Thomas and Evelyn, who were in the front row, smiling proudly. The first notes echoed through the air, and John let the music flow from within him, like a river finally finding its course. The audience was captivated, song after song, feeling the passion and emotion in every chord, in every verse. John wasn't just playing. He was sharing a part of his soul, a story of pain, overcoming, and hope. When the last chord sounded, there was a deep silence, followed by an explosion of applause. John, emotional, looked up at the sky and felt as if Margaret was there, watching and smiling. She had always known the potential he had, and now he finally saw it too. Back in the village, John was welcomed as a hero. The people who once saw him as a stranger now embraced him as one of their own. He had not only found a new home but had built one, brick by brick, with the help of Thomas, Evelyn, and everyone who believed in him. As time went on, John continued to teach music, to compose, and to live each day with gratitude for the present and respect for the past. He knew that life would never be free of challenges or losses, but he also knew that there would always be something more, something worth fighting for. Evelyn, Thomas, and John formed an unlikely family, united not by blood but by bonds that were stronger than anything that could be explained. They discovered that sometimes, the mysterious things we find along the way, like an old letter or a forgotten guitar, can lead us to unexpected destinations. And in those destinations, we can find not only answers but ourselves. John, who was once at the bottom of the well, now looked to the future with hope. He had learned that even in the darkest moments, there is always a light waiting to be found. And with this new perspective, he was ready to face whatever life had in store for him.